welcome. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Or, I might show up at your door. I'm just here to share some creepy stories, so sit back and enjoy. Disclaimer: the content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. The first thing that woke me was the sound. A piercing, mechanical wail that seemed to echo inside my skull. My phone vibrated violently on the nightstand, its screen flashing in a dull blue glow. Groggy and disoriented, I reached for it, fumbling to silence the incessant noise. But before I could swipe it off, the alert filled my screen with bold red text. Emergency alert. Stay off the ground. Remain elevated. Do not attempt to leave your location. For a moment, I stared at the words, unable to process them. Stay off the ground? What kind of nonsense was this? My half-asleep brain assumed it had to be a glitch, some mistake in the system. I set the phone down and rubbed my eyes, ready to climb back under the covers, when another sound made my blood freeze. A scream, sharp and raw, cutting through the quiet suburban night. I bolted upright, heart hammering. It wasn't just one scream. It was joined by others, distant, frantic cries that swelled and died in horrifying bursts. I scrambled to my feet, rushing to the window, and pulled the curtain back an inch. The street outside was eerily empty. Porch lights flickered, casting jittery shadows, but there was no one in sight. It was quiet now, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. And yet, something felt wrong. My eyes darted between the houses, scanning the manicured lawns and parked cars. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement near the edge of the street. At first, I thought it was a person, but it moved too fast, its form dark and distorted, almost blurry. It zipped between two cars and disappeared, leaving a faint rustling sound in its wake. My stomach churned. What was that? A dog? No dog moved like that. My phone buzzed again, the vibration snapping me out of my thoughts. The screen flashed once more, the same bold text glaring back at me. Do not touch the ground. Remain elevated. Seek shelter immediately. Okay, this was no glitch. My chest tightened as I stepped back from the window, suddenly hyper-aware of how exposed I was. Something was happening out there, something real, and I had no idea what it was. I flipped on the TV, desperate for answers. The emergency broadcast screen filled the screen, accompanied by a droning beep. A robotic voice spoke, cold and detached. This is a national emergency. Dangerous entities have been identified in your area. Do not leave your location. Remain elevated. Do not attempt contact with unknown individuals or creatures. Repeat. Stay off the ground. The voice repeated the message, but it offered no explanation. Dangerous entities? Creatures? What the hell was this? My hands trembled as I switched the TV off, the silence feeling heavier now. I tried to convince myself it was some bizarre government drill, but my gut told me otherwise. The screams outside had stopped, but the unease hadn't. I moved to the hallway, flicking on every light as I went. My attic, yes, the attic. That was elevated, right? I could wait this out there. The thought of climbing into the cramped, dusty space wasn't comforting, but it beat staying on the ground floor. I grabbed a flashlight and a few essentials. My phone charger, some snacks, and a baseball bat, just in case. As I climbed the narrow pull-down ladder to the attic, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. Felt like something was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a face staring back from the shadows, but there was nothing. Still, I didn't linger. The attic was dark and smelled like old wood and insulation. I switched on the flashlight, its beam slicing through the gloom. Stacks of boxes and forgotten junk loomed like sentinels, but at least it felt safe, secure. I pulled the ladder up behind me and closed the hatch, sealing myself in. Minutes passed, or was it hours? Time seemed to stretch in the suffocating silence. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor, my back against an old chest, staring at the dusty beams above. My phone buzzed periodically, but I didn't look. I didn't want to see another alert. Then I heard it. A sound so faint I almost missed it. Scratching. It was coming from below, soft and deliberate, like nails dragging against wood. My grip tightened on the flashlight, and I held my breath, straining to hear. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, until it was directly beneath the attic hatch. I froze. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as the realization hit me. Whatever was out there knew I was here. The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a low, guttural growl rumbled from below, sending a shiver down my spine. It wasn't an animal. Couldn't be. There was something wrong about the sound, something that made my skin crawl. I didn't dare move. Suddenly, there was a loud thud, and the hatch trembled as if something heavy had slammed against it. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp, my entire body trembling. The flashlight beam quivered as I aimed it toward the hatch, expecting it to burst open at any second. The thudding continued, each impact more forceful than the last. I bit down hard on my lip, the taste of copper filling my mouth as I fought to stay silent. And then, just as abruptly as it started, the noise stopped. I waited, straining to hear. My muscles ached from being tensed for so long, but I didn't dare relax. Minutes passed, and the silence stretched on, broken only by the faint creaks of the house settling. Whatever was down there had left, or so I hoped. The phone buzzed again, and I nearly dropped it in surprise. My trembling hands fumbled with the device as another alert appeared. They are sensitive to movement. Remain still. Do not make noise. The knot in my stomach tightened. Whoever they were, they weren't human. My mind raced through every horror movie I'd ever seen, conjuring images of shadowy figures with glowing eyes or skeletal beasts with razor-sharp claws. I tried to tell myself it was ridiculous, that nothing like that could be real. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't some overblown government warning. Something was out there, something dangerous, something hunting. And it wasn't just outside. It was inside, too. The scratching started again, softer this time, as if whatever was down there was toying with me. I clenched the baseball bat tighter, my knuckles turning white. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. Not even close. And I had a feeling it was only going to get worse. For hours, I sat in the attic, paralyzed with fear. My muscles ached from staying perfectly still, and my hands throbbed from gripping the baseball bat so tightly. I kept the flashlight off, the only illumination coming from the faint moonlight seeping through a small, dusty window near the roofline. My phone sat in my lap, its screen dimmed to conserve battery, though I couldn't bring myself to turn it off. Any update, even a meaningless alert, felt like a lifeline. Eventually, the scratching below stopped altogether. The silence was deafening, oppressive. I strained my ears, listening for any hint of movement, but the house had returned to its usual creaks and groans. I let out a shaky breath, feeling my nerves begin to unravel. Maybe they had gone. Maybe whatever was hunting out there had moved on to easier prey. I crawled on all fours to the attic window, careful to avoid knocking into anything that might make noise. My breath fogged the glass as I peered out, surveying the neighborhood below. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, illuminating lawns and driveways that looked strangely normal. But the silence, it wasn't normal. In my neighborhood, even at night, you could usually hear something. A dog barking, a car passing, someone's TV humming faintly through an open window. Now there was nothing. It was like the world had been muted. Movement drew my attention to the house across the street, Mr. Callahan's place. His porch light flickered erratically, casting odd, stuttering patterns on his front lawn. I squinted, trying to see what had caught my eye. There, at the edge of his driveway, something was shifting. A dark, indistinct form hunched low to the ground. I froze, my breath hitching. Was it a person? A stray animal? It was hard to tell from this distance. The figure didn't move like anything I'd ever seen. It was twitchy, jittering forward in short, unnatural bursts. My gut churned as the form paused, its shadow stretching impossibly long under the flickering light. And then Mr. Callahan himself appeared. His front door swung open, and he stepped out onto the porch, holding a flashlight in one hand and a golf club in the other. I almost shouted at him to stop, to go back inside, but I bit my tongue. He wouldn't hear me from up here, and even if he did, what could I say? Don't go outside. There's something? Still, my heart raced as I watched him. He moved with the kind of sluggish determination that comes from someone who's just woken up. He swept the flashlight across his lawn, the beam dancing over shrubs and flower beds before landing on the dark form at the edge of his driveway. I saw him hesitate, his shoulders stiffening as he focused on whatever was out there. For a moment, everything was still. Then, slowly, he stepped off the porch and onto the lawn. "No," I whispered, pressing my hand against the glass. My pulse thundered in my ears as I watched him inch closer, his flashlight fixed on the creature. Didn't move, didn't react. It just crouched there, motionless. Mr. Callahan stopped a few feet away, his body tense. "Hey!" he called, his voice carrying through the still night. "What the hell are you doing out here?" The thing moved then, fast. Too fast. One moment, it was crouching at the edge of the driveway. The next, it was on him, a blur of black that knocked him off his feet. I jerked back from the window, a strangled cry escaping my throat. By the time I forced myself to look again, it was already over. Mr. Callahan was gone. His flashlight lay on the lawn, its beam cutting a diagonal line across the grass. The golf club had rolled to the edge of the porch, its polished surface glinting under the flickering light. But there was no sign of him, no sign of the creature, just a faint, dark streak leading toward the street. I clamped a hand over my mouth, my mind racing. He hadn't even had time to scream. Whatever that thing was, it had taken him in seconds. My stomach twisted as I stared at the empty lawn, my thoughts spiraling. What if I'd shouted? Could I have warned him? Would it have made a difference? Probably not. The way it moved, the speed, the precision, there was no escaping it. The emergency alerts flashed in my mind. Stay off the ground. Remain elevated. I didn't know what those creatures were, but they clearly weren't bound by the same rules as us. They were predators and we were their prey. I sat back, my knees pulled to my chest, and stared at the flashlight still shining on Mr. Callahan's lawn. My thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear and guilt. He was gone because he didn't listen to the warnings. Would I be next? How long could I stay up here? What if the creatures came back and decided to tear through the house? Could they climb? The attic suddenly felt too small, too fragile. The walls seemed thinner, the hatch less secure. Every creak of the house made me jump, my ears straining for the slightest sound of movement. I thought about calling for help, but my phone's battery was already dangerously low. And who would I call? Anyway, the police? They were probably dealing with the same nightmare or worse. Another buzz startled me, and I nearly dropped the phone. A new alert had appeared on the screen, the letters stark and ominous. They are drawn to movement and noise. Remain still. Do not engage. My breath hitched. Drawn to movement and noise. It explained how Mr. Callahan had been attacked so quickly. He'd made himself a target the moment he stepped outside. My thoughts turned to the flashlight lying on his lawn, its beam still shining. Was it attracting them now? Were they circling, waiting for the right moment to strike again? A faint sound reached me then, a rustling, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I pressed my ear to the attic floor, my pulse quickening. The sound was coming from below, soft and deliberate. It wasn't scratching this time. It was footsteps. They were inside. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. The creaks of the wooden floor below me sent chills down my spine. They weren't human, at least not entirely. The sound was uneven, like something dragging itself along with an awkward gait. I pressed my ear closer to the attic floor, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to do anything but sit there paralyzed. But I couldn't. My body refused to cooperate. I was frozen, my entire world reduced to the rhythmic thuds of those alien steps. Then they stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. My breath hitched as I strained to hear, every nerve on edge. The floor below me creaked again, followed by a faint tapping, almost like claws testing the surface. I clenched the baseball bat in my hands, the rough wood biting into my palms. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. They know I'm here. The thought struck me like a lightning bolt. The faint scratching, the deliberate movements, they weren't random. They were searching. I turned off my phone's screen, plunging myself into near-total darkness. The dim moonlight filtering through the attic window was my only source of light now, and even that felt too bright, too exposing. My hands trembled as I adjusted my grip on the bat, holding it like a lifeline. A new sound reached me then, low and guttural. A growl, deep and vibrating with menace. It wasn't coming from below this time. It was closer. My blood ran cold as I realized it was coming from inside the attic. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. The flashlight lay forgotten at my feet, but I didn't dare reach for it. In the shadows, something moved. A shape, tall, distorted, shifted near the far corner of the attic, where the boxes cast long, jagged shadows. I froze, my eyes locked on the figure. It stood unnaturally still, its outline barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. But I could feel it watching me. My mind raced. I needed to do something, anything. But what? Run? Hide? Fight? None of those options felt viable. The thing in the corner was massive, its presence filling the cramped space like a thundercloud. I could make out the faint gleam of what looked like eyes, two pinpricks of light reflecting the dim moonlight. They blinked, slow, deliberate. I bit down on my lip, hard enough to taste blood, forcing myself to stay silent. The creature shifted again, its movements smooth and almost fluid. I could hear the faint scrape of its limbs against the wooden beams, the soft rustle of its body as it began to move toward me. Don't make noise. Don't move. The alert's instructions echoed in my mind. They were my only lifeline, my only strategy. I pressed myself against the wall, every muscle locked in place, as the creature crept closer. The attic hatch creaked suddenly, the sound splitting the silence like a gunshot. My heart lurched as I realized the noise had come from below. The creature stopped, its head snapping toward the hatch in a sharp, unnatural motion. It was listening. Another sound followed, scraping, clawing. The creatures below were trying to get in. I could hear them now, their guttural growls and harsh breaths filling the space beneath me. The walls seemed thinner, the attic less secure with every passing second. The thing in the attic turned back to me, its head tilting in a way that made my stomach churn. It was studying me. I could feel its gaze boring into me, its presence oppressive and suffocating. The instinct to run was overwhelming, but I knew it would be suicide. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from below. The creatures downstairs had broken through. The sound was deafening, followed by a cacophony of growls and thudding footsteps. The thing in the attic jerked toward the noise, its movements sharp and predatory. For a moment, I thought it might leave, drawn by the commotion. But then it turned back to me. The creature let out a low, guttural sound, a mix between a growl and a hiss. It was deliberate, almost taunting. My chest tightened as it began to move closer, its body undulating in a way that made my skin crawl. I pressed myself harder against the wall, my grip on the bat so tight my knuckles turned white. I had to do something. Staying still wasn't going to save me anymore. My eyes darted around the attic, searching for anything that could give me an edge. My flashlight, lying just a few feet away, felt like an impossible distance. The old chest I'd been leaning against earlier was within reach, but I doubted it held anything useful. Then my eyes landed on the window. It was small, barely big enough to squeeze through, but it was my only chance. If I could get out onto the roof, I might be able to escape. The thought of stepping onto the open rooftop, exposed and vulnerable, was terrifying, but staying here was a death sentence. The creature was only a few feet away now, its movements slow and deliberate. It knew I had nowhere to go. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, and I could hear the faint sound of its breathing, low, steady, and menacing. I waited until it took another step forward. Then I made my move. Grabbing the baseball bat, I swung it toward the flashlight, sending it skidding across the attic floor. The sudden motion drew the creature's attention instantly. It lunged toward the sound, its body moving with inhuman speed. I didn't wait to see if it worked. I scrambled toward the window, throwing the latch open and pushing the pane outward. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I shoved my upper body through the narrow opening, twisting and contorting to fit. Behind me, the creature let out an ear-splitting screech. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, high-pitched and grating, like metal tearing against metal. It filled the attic, echoing in my ears as I forced myself through the window. The shingles were rough and cold under my hands as I pulled myself onto the roof. I was panting, my breath visible in the chilly air. The neighborhood stretched out below me, quiet and eerily still. But I didn't have time to process the view. From inside the attic, the screeching grew louder, more frantic. The thing was coming. The cold roof felt unstable beneath me, the tiles slick with dew. I crouched low, pressing myself against the slope as I tried to steady my shaking hands. The screeches inside the attic turned into furious thuds as the creature slammed against the window I just escaped through. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. Then the window frame splintered. The creature forced its way through, its elongated limbs bending unnaturally as it squeezed itself onto the roof. The sight was grotesque, like watching a spider escape a narrow crevice, its body contorting in ways that defied reason. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. My survival instincts kicked in, and I scrambled across the rooftop, my shoes slipping on the damp shingles. The houses in the neighborhood were spaced far apart, and the only way down from the roof was the ground. The one place I couldn't afford to be. Behind me, the creature let out another screech, its claws scraping against the tiles as it moved in pursuit. I risked a glance back and immediately regretted it. It was faster than I expected, its movements both erratic and calculated, like it was toying with me. I kept moving, my breath coming in short gasps. My plan, if I even had one, was simple: stay out of its reach. But that was easier said than done. The rooftop offered no cover, no escape routes, just an endless expanse of slippery tiles and a steep drop on all sides. Reaching the edge, I paused, my mind racing. The roof sloped down toward the backyard, where a narrow alleyway separated my house from the one behind it. If I could make it across that gap, I might be able to find shelter in the neighbor's house, or at least buy myself a few precious seconds. The gap wasn't far, maybe 10 feet at most. But in the darkness, with the slick tiles and the creature bearing down on me, it felt like a mile. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Behind me, the creature hissed, its claws clicking against the tiles as it drew closer. "Okay," I whispered to myself. "You've got one shot at this." I backed up a few steps, ignoring the way my feet slid on the wet surface, and launched myself forward. The wind whipped past me as I leapt, the ground below a dark void that threatened to swallow me whole. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, I was weightless. Then my hands caught the edge of the neighboring roof. Pain shot through my arms as my body slammed into the side of the house, but I held on. The shingles dug into my palms as I hauled myself up, my muscles screaming in protest. I collapsed onto the roof, gasping for air, my chest heaving. But there was no time to rest. The creature screeched in frustration, and I turned to see it poised at the edge of my roof, its glowing eyes locked onto me. For a moment, I dared to hope it wouldn't make the jump. Then it crouched low, its limbs coiling like springs, and launched itself into the air. I barely rolled out of the way as it landed, its claws gouging deep grooves into the tiles where I'd been moments before. The roof shook under its weight, the vibrations threatening to knock me off balance. It moved with terrifying speed, closing the distance between us in seconds. I swung the baseball bat in a blind panic, the wooden weapon connecting with a sickening thud. The creature recoiled, letting out a high-pitched wail that made my ears ring. The bat splintered in my hands, the force of the impact jarring my arms. But it worked. The creature staggered back, giving me a precious moment to act. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around for an escape. The rooftop was a dead end, the gap to the next house too far to jump. Below, the alley loomed dark and uninviting, but it was my only option. Without thinking, I slid down the sloped edge of the roof and dropped into the alley. The impact rattled my bones, pain shooting through my legs as I hit the ground. I stumbled but managed to stay upright, my adrenaline masking the worst of the pain. Above me, the creature roared, its screeches echoing off the surrounding walls. I looked up to see it peering over the edge of the roof, its glowing eyes tracking my every move. I ran. The alley stretched out before me, narrow and cluttered with trash cans and discarded furniture. My shoes slapped against the pavement, the sound painfully loud in the otherwise silent night. Every step felt like a struggle, my muscles burning and my lungs screaming for air. Behind me, the creature leapt from the roof, its landing shaking the ground. The sound of its pursuit was deafening, claws scraping against concrete, its guttural growls filling the air. It was faster than me, stronger, and relentless. But I had one advantage. I knew the neighborhood. I darted around a corner, narrowly avoiding a stack of wooden pallets, and slid through a narrow gap between two fences. The creature followed, smashing through the barrier like it was paper. Splinters flew through the air, and I shielded my face, my heart pounding. The street opened up ahead, the flickering glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. My neighbor's garage door stood open, the interior dark and silent. It was a gamble, but I had no choice. I sprinted toward the garage, my legs screaming in protest. Behind me, the creature let out another roar, the sound so close I could feel the vibrations in my chest. I dove into the garage, hitting the concrete floor hard. Rolling onto my back, I kicked at the button to lower the door. The motor whirred to life, the door descending agonizingly slowly. The creature lunged, its claws scraping against the concrete just as the door slammed shut. For a moment, there was silence. Then the pounding began. The pounding on the garage door was relentless, each impact reverberating through the concrete floor. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling as the creature threw itself against the metal barrier. I backed away, my legs trembling, the taste of blood and adrenaline thick in my mouth. The garage was pitch dark, save for a faint glow filtering through the gaps around the door. My breathing was ragged, too loud in the oppressive silence that followed each deafening crash. I knew it wouldn't hold for long. I groped blindly for anything I could use as a weapon. My hands brushed against a workbench, the tools scattered haphazardly across its surface. A wrench, a screwdriver, a rusted hammer. They weren't much, but they were better than nothing. I grabbed the hammer, its weight reassuring in my hand. The door buckled under another powerful strike. I flinched, my grip tightening on the hammer. A jagged tear appeared near the bottom corner, the sharp edge glinting in the faint light. Through the gap, I caught a glimpse of the creature's eyes, glowing, hateful, and locked onto me. It hissed, a guttural sound that made my skin crawl, and clawed at the opening, widening it with terrifying ease. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over an old oil can. My mind raced. There was no way I could fight this thing head-on. The garage door wouldn't hold, and the house was too far away to reach without being caught. Then I saw it, the storm cellar. The small metal doors were embedded in the concrete floor near the back of the garage. I didn't even know if they were unlocked, let alone where they led. But it didn't matter. They were my only option. I dropped to my knees, fumbling with the latch. It was stiff, the rusted metal refusing to budge. Behind me, the garage door screeched as the creature forced its way inside. The sound of tearing metal was deafening, each shred of the door bringing it closer to me. Come on, come on. I whispered frantically, my hands slipping on the latch. The door finally gave, swinging open with a loud groan. A set of narrow stairs descended into darkness, the air below cold and damp. Without hesitation, I slid into the opening, pulling the cellar doors shut above me. The creature let out a piercing shriek as the last sliver of light disappeared, plunging me into blackness. My heart hammered in my chest as I fumbled for the latch, securing it just as the pounding began again, this time directly overhead. The metal vibrated with each impact, the sound echoing in the confined space. I backed down the stairs, my hands trailing along the rough stone walls for support. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, each breath heavy and suffocating. The cellar was small and cramped, the walls lined with old shelves filled with forgotten tools and canned goods. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, its chain swaying slightly in the draft. I reached for it, pulling the chain to illuminate the space. The dim light revealed more than I wanted to see. Scratches covered the walls, deep, jagged marks that gouged through the stone like it was butter. The shelves were toppled in places, their contents scattered across the floor. Whatever had been down here before me had been trapped, just like I was now. A faint noise caught my attention, a soft, wet slithering sound. My stomach churned as I turned toward the far corner of the cellar. Something moved. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the flickering light. But then it shifted again, pulling itself into view. The creature was smaller than the one above, its limbs thinner and less defined, but its eyes were the same, glowing and inhuman. It let out a low growl, its head tilting as it studied me. "Not again," I muttered under my breath, gripping the hammer tighter. The smaller creature moved toward me, its body undulating in a way that made my stomach churn. It was slower than the larger one, its movements jerky and uncoordinated, but it was no less threatening. I swung the hammer as it lunged, the impact sending a shockwave up my arm. The creature screeched, its body crumpling to the floor. I didn't wait to see if it would get back up. The pounding overhead grew more frantic, the metal doors rattling in their frame. The larger creature was close, and I had nowhere left to run. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could help. In the corner, an old metal pipe jutted out from the wall, rusted and leaking. Next to it, a broken valve. An idea began to form, desperate and half-baked but better than nothing. I grabbed the valve, twisting it with all my strength. The pipe groaned, water spurting out in a weak stream. "Come on," I shouted, yanking harder. The pipe burst with a deafening crack, spraying water everywhere. The floor quickly became slick, the air filled with the sound of rushing liquid. The pounding on the doors stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then a loud crash echoed through the cellar as the metal doors were ripped away. The creature dropped into the room, its massive body slamming into the ground with a wet thud. It hissed, its glowing eyes narrowing as it took in the flooded space. I backed into the corner, my heart racing. The water was rising fast, pooling around the creature's legs as it advanced toward me. This first step was cautious, the slick floor making it stumble slightly. I seized the moment, grabbing the nearest object, a jagged piece of wood from a broken shelf, and hurled it at the exposed pipe. The makeshift spear struck true, puncturing the pipe further. Steam hissed as hot water sprayed out, engulfing the creature in a scalding cloud. It screeched, its body convulsing as it tried to retreat. The confined space amplified its cries, the sound almost unbearable. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I sprinted up the stairs, slipping on the wet steps but forcing myself forward. Above me, the night was still dark and quiet, the street eerily empty. I slammed the cellar doors shut behind me, my chest heaving as I collapsed onto the damp grass. The creature's screeches faded into the distance, replaced by the deafening silence of the night. But I knew it wasn't over. I stayed on the damp grass for only a moment, chest heaving and legs trembling. My mind screamed at me to keep moving. The creature was hurt, but not dead, and it wasn't alone. The memory of that smaller one in the cellar made my skin crawl. The street was deserted, eerily still under the pale glow of flickering streetlights. Shadows stretched long and thin across the cracked pavement, every shape threatening to come alive. The silence was oppressive, broken only by my shallow breaths and the distant dripping of water. I rose unsteadily to my feet, clutching the rusted hammer I'd carried from the garage. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I scanned my surroundings, searching for the next place to hide or regroup. My house was out of the question, too exposed, too compromised. There was a convenience store a few blocks away, a 24-hour joint that stayed open no matter what. Its neon sign was usually visible from my street, a glowing beacon in the darkness. But tonight it was dark. Still, it was the only idea I had. I moved cautiously, sticking to the edges of the street where the shadows offered some cover. Every sound made me jump: rustling leaves, a distant dog barking, the hum of a streetlight struggling to stay on. My head swiveled constantly, scanning for movement. Then I heard it, a faint clicking sound, like claws tapping against concrete. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, and getting closer. I pressed myself against the wall of a nearby house, my back flat against the cold brick. My fingers tightened around the hammer, sweat slicking my palm. The clicking grew louder, accompanied by a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. I dared a glance around the corner and immediately regretted it. Two of them, they moved in unison, their glowing eyes scanning the street. One was smaller, similar to the one in the cellar, its movements jerky and uncertain. The other was larger, but not as massive as the one from the garage. Its limbs were longer, more agile, and it carried itself with a terrifying confidence. I held my breath, willing myself to disappear into the shadows. The creatures stopped in the middle of the street, their heads swiveling as they sniffed the air. They were hunting me. My heart thundered in my chest as I tried to think. Running would draw their attention, and there was nowhere nearby to hide. If I stayed here, they'd find me eventually. The hammer felt useless in my hand, its weight a cruel reminder of how unprepared I was. A faint noise broke through the silence, a car engine in the distance. It was faint, barely audible, but enough to draw the creature's attention. Their heads snapped toward the sound, their bodies tensing as if ready to pounce. I took the chance and moved. Keeping low, I crept along the side of the house, my steps slow and deliberate. Each second felt like an eternity, the distance to the next alleyway stretching endlessly before me. The creatures didn't notice, their focus still on the faint noise. I reached the alley and ducked inside, pressing myself against the cool concrete. My breathing was shallow, every inhale threatening to give me away. The creatures didn't follow. I allowed myself a brief moment of relief, but it was short-lived. The alley led to a narrow side street, its path littered with debris. Garbage cans, broken pallets, and abandoned bikes created an obstacle course I had to navigate silently. The clicking started again, this time closer. My stomach dropped as I realized the creatures had split up. One was still in the main street, but the other had circled around, its movements echoing through the alley. I couldn't stay hidden. I moved quickly but carefully, weaving between the obstacles. Every step felt like a gamble, each misplaced footfall threatening to give me away. The alley opened up into another residential street, the houses dark and silent. Across the street, I spotted a church. Its tall steeple loomed against the night sky, the building's heavy wooden doors slightly ajar. A sliver of light spilled out, faint but warm. It was risky, but it was better than staying out in the open. I sprinted across the street, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. The creature in the alley let out a shriek, the sound sharp and piercing. It had heard me. I didn't look back. The church doors were heavier than I expected, their old hinges groaning as I pushed them open. I slipped inside and slammed them shut, the sound reverberating through the cavernous space. For a moment, there was silence. Then the banging started. The creature was at the door, its claws raking against the wood. I backed away, my eyes darting around the dimly lit interior. The church was empty, the pews dusty and abandoned. A few candles flickered near the altar, their flames casting long shadows across the stone walls. I spotted a staircase leading to the bell tower and made a beeline for it. The creature's screeches grew louder as the door splintered under its assault. The stairs were narrow and steep, each step creaking under my weight. I climbed as fast as I could, my legs burning with effort. The air grew colder the higher I went, the sound of the creature's pursuit echoing up the stairwell. The bell tower was small, its floor covered in dust and bird droppings. A large, rusted bell hung in the center, its rope swaying slightly in the draft. I pressed myself against the wall, gripping the hammer tightly. The creature burst into the tower, its glowing eyes scanning the room. It let out a low growl, its body crouching as it prepared to strike. I had nowhere left to run. The hammer felt heavy in my hand, the realization of my situation sinking in. This was it, the end of the line. But then I noticed the bell rope. An idea formed, desperate and reckless. I gripped the rope and pulled with all my strength. The bell let out a deafening clang, the sound so loud it felt like it rattled my very bones. The creature recoiled, its shrieks drowned out by the bell's toll. I kept pulling, each ring disorienting it further. For a moment I thought I had a chance. Then the floor gave way. The ground beneath me trembled. I felt it before I heard it. A deep, gut-wrenching vibration, as if the very bones of the church were cracking. The bell, still ringing, seemed to amplify the tremors, the clangs echoing through the tower as the creature shrieked in confusion and rage. Then, with a sudden, brutal force, the floor beneath my feet splintered. I didn't have time to react. The wood cracked wide open and I was falling. I hit the ground hard. For a split second, everything went black. The air was knocked out of my lungs, and my body felt like it was in a freefall, tumbling through space. I gasped, trying to force air back into my lungs, but I couldn't. Everything was spinning. Everything hurt. When I finally came to my senses, I was lying on the cold stone floor of what looked like the church's crypt. It smelled of decay, the air thick and musty, mingled with the sharp tang of old incense. Dim, flickering lights from a few candles cast long shadows on the walls, making the place feel more like a tomb than a sanctuary. I pushed myself up, my vision blurry and my body bruised from the fall. My head throbbed, but I didn't have time to worry about that. The creature was still up there, and it wouldn't take long for it to realize I wasn't where it expected. I stumbled to my feet, dizziness washing over me as I tried to steady myself. The crypt was narrow, with stone walls and a low ceiling. Shelves lined the sides, stacked with old coffins and remnants of forgotten rituals. The air was oppressive, thick with an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. A small iron door stood at the far end of the crypt, barely visible in the flickering candlelight. The last thing I wanted was to be trapped in here, but it was my only way out. I reached for the door handle, but before I could grasp it, a sound echoed from above, faint but unmistakable. The creature was coming down. I ran to the door, pulling it open with a creak that sent a chill down my spine. It led to a narrow passageway, barely wide enough for me to move through without brushing the walls. The air was colder in the hallway, and the faintest draft made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't look back. The sound of the creature's claws scraping against the stone floor above sent adrenaline surging through me. I moved as quickly as I could through the dark passage, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The hallway twisted and turned, its sharp corners disorienting me. But I didn't care. I just needed to get away. The passage opened into a small, dimly lit room. A single candle flickered on a stone pedestal in the center, casting eerie shadows on the walls. But what really caught my attention were the symbols. Strange, arcane marks etched into the stone, covering the walls and floor. I recognized them instantly. They were the same symbols I'd seen in the basement of the old mansion where I'd grown up, the place where I'd first encountered these creatures. They were more than just markings. They were warnings. Warnings that had been ignored for years. I stepped cautiously into the room, feeling the temperature drop even further. The air was thick with an ancient power, a force that seemed to weigh down on me. It felt as if the walls themselves were alive, watching. Then I heard it, the softest scrape of claws against stone. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The creature had found me, but it wasn't just one creature. There were more. They emerged from the shadows, their glowing eyes like lanterns in the darkness. I counted at least 3, maybe 4 of them, their bodies sleek and alien, twisted in ways that made my skin crawl. They moved silently, like predators closing in on their prey. I backed away slowly, my mind racing for a plan. Any plan. I couldn't outrun them. I couldn't fight them. But then I saw it. A small altar in the corner of the room, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. On it was a stone tablet, engraved with the same symbols as the ones on the walls. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was my only hope. I dashed toward the altar, my footsteps heavy and frantic. The creatures followed, their eyes burning with an unnatural hunger. I grabbed the tablet, feeling its cold surface against my fingers. The moment I touched it, a jolt of energy surged through me, like electricity coursing through my veins. The creatures shrieked in unison, their glowing eyes narrowing as they recoiled from the altar. For a brief moment, I thought I had control, but then the ground began to tremble again, and the walls around me started to crack. I had no time to think. The energy radiating from the tablet was overwhelming, flooding the room with a blinding light. The creatures shrieked again, their bodies writhing as if in agony. The ceiling above cracked open with a deafening roar, and from the darkness above, I saw it. Something larger than all the others, its eyes burning brighter than the sun. It was the thing that had been hunting me all along. The world around me seemed to collapse. The walls caved in, the floor buckled, and everything was swallowed by the light. I felt myself being pulled toward it, toward the creature, no, the force that controlled them all. As I fell, I heard one final shriek, then nothing. The world around me was a blur of light and shadow, a chaotic swirl that left me disoriented and weightless. My body felt like it was being stretched and compressed at the same time, as if I were caught between 2 dimensions. The walls of the crypt, the altar, the creatures, all of it seemed to dissolve into a bright, painful radiance. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The air felt thick, oppressive, and yet somehow hollow. It was as if I were drowning in the light. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. I opened my eyes, but I wasn't in the crypt anymore. I wasn't anywhere I recognized. The landscape stretched out before me, barren and empty. Nothing but cracked earth, a sky choked with swirling clouds, and an eerie, suffocating silence. There was no wind. There were no sounds, no life, just the oppressive feeling of being watched, as if the very air itself were alive. I stumbled forward, my legs shaky and unsteady. I couldn't remember how I got here, but I knew this place was wrong. The ground beneath me was cold, desolate. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Marks on the earth, as if something had been dragged across the landscape. Deep gouges in the ground, large and irregular. They were fresh. I hesitated. Then I heard it, a low hum, vibrating through the air like the sound of a massive engine. It echoed all around me, reverberating in my bones. It came from above, something massive, something that didn't belong. I looked up, and what I saw took my breath away. Above me, hanging in the blackened sky, was a colossal shape. Its edges were blurry, undefined, like a cloud made of shadows. It moved slowly, methodically, as if it were observing me from above. And with every passing second, it seemed to draw closer, its form growing clearer and more distinct. A feeling of dread washed over me. The creature, or whatever it was, had found me. I turned and began to run, the ground beneath me shifting as I stumbled over the jagged rocks and uneven earth. The hum grew louder, more deafening. I could feel it in my chest, pounding like the beat of a war drum. I didn't know where I was running, but I couldn't stop. The creature was coming closer, its shadow darkening the sky above. Then I saw it, a break in the landscape, a fissure in the earth, a massive crack that seemed to lead into the depths of the planet itself. It was my only chance, the only escape from whatever that thing was. I ran toward it, my breath ragged, my legs aching. But as I neared the edge of the chasm, I realized something. The marks on the ground, the gouges, they led directly into the crack, and they weren't fresh. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The marks weren't from something escaping, they were from something being pulled in. The creature was trying to drag me into this void. I skidded to a stop just inches from the edge, my heart pounding in my chest. The crack yawned before me, a terrifying abyss that seemed to pulse with an unnatural life of its own. And that's when I saw it, something moving in the depths. I couldn't make it out at first, but as the ground trembled beneath my feet, the shape became clearer. It was massive, impossibly large, writhing like a serpent. Its eyes burned with an otherworldly light, and as it emerged from the chasm, I could see that it was covered in thick, spiny scales, its limbs long and twisted in ways that no creature should be. It was the thing that had been calling the creatures, pulling them into this world. The creature that had been hunting me. I was too far gone to escape. The ground gave way beneath me. I fell. I plunged into the darkness, the air rushing past me in a cold, terrifying blur. My body felt like it was being torn apart as I descended, faster and faster, into the abyss below. Then, with a jolt that felt like the very bones of the earth breaking, I hit the ground. I didn't die. At least, I don't think I did. I woke up, but the world I found myself in was even worse than before. I was no longer in the crypt or in that barren landscape. I was somewhere else, somewhere far more terrifying. The walls around me were smooth, made of an obsidian-like material that seemed to absorb the light. Strange, twisting symbols were carved into every surface, glowing faintly with an eerie, pulsating energy. I felt the presence before I saw it. A whisper, low and guttural, slid through my mind. It wasn't words, but I understood it all the same. It wanted me, it had me. The creature was no longer an abstract threat. It was here, in this place, and it was moving toward me. I didn't know how much time had passed, minutes, hours, or days, but it was getting closer. The walls closed in, the space growing smaller with every breath I took. The air was thick with its presence, suffocating, pulling at my very soul. It was here to claim me, and then, in that instant, I knew this wasn't just a fight for survival. It wasn't just about escaping. It was about becoming part of something far older, far more powerful than anything I could comprehend. I had already lost.